The morning sun cast long shadows across Arlington National Cemetery as Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez adjusted his pristine white gloves for the 100th time. Today marked his first day as a tomb guard at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, a position he had trained 18 months to achieve. The weight of his M14 rifle felt familiar in his hands, but the responsibility on his shoulders felt heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. Rodriguez had dreamed of this moment since he was 12 years old, watching a documentary about the elite soldiers who guarded America's most sacred memorial. The Tomb Guards, officially known as Sentinels, represented the highest honor in the military ceremonial world. Only the most disciplined, dedicated soldiers could earn the right to wear the distinctive uniform and maintain the eternal vigil. The training had been brutal. Rodriguez remembered the endless hours of practice, learning to march exactly 21 steps in precisely 21 seconds. Every movement had to be perfect. The turn at each end of his route, the rifle inspection ceremony, even the way he held his head. His instructors had been merciless, rejecting candidates for the smallest imperfections. Out of his original class of 37 hopefuls, only 4 had made it through the complete program. As Rodriguez took his position for the changing of the guard ceremony, he noticed a group of military academy cadets gathering near the memorial. They wore the distinctive gray uniforms of West Point, their brass buttons gleaming in the morning light. There were about 15 of them, all appearing to be in their late teens or early 20s. Their instructor, a stern-faced colonel with silver hair, was explaining the significance of the tomb to the young officers in training. The ceremony began with the traditional precision that had been maintained for decades. Rodriguez's relief guard approached with measured steps, his movements synchronized to an internal rhythm that every tomb guard knew by heart. The crowd of tourists and visitors fell silent, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something sacred. Rodriguez executed his final inspection of the relief guard's weapon with practiced expertise. He examined every inch of the M14 rifle, checking for any speck of dust or imperfection. Finding none, he nodded approval and began his own march toward the guard quarters. As he walked, he could hear the colonel continuing his explanation to the cadets about the tomb's history and the dedication required of its guardians. The unknown soldier's tomb contained the remains of unidentified American servicemen from World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and originally from Vietnam, though the Vietnam unknown had been identified through DNA testing in 1998 and removed. Each represented thousands of soldiers whose sacrifice would never be individually recognized, making this memorial a symbol of ultimate service to country. Rodriguez had memorized every detail about the tomb during his training. The white marble sarcophagus weighed 29 tons and had been carved from a single block of stone. The inscription on the east side read, "Here rests in honored glory an American soldier known but to God." 3 marble figures adorned the sides, representing peace, victory, and valor. As Rodriguez reached the guard quarters, he could still hear the colonel's voice carrying across the plaza. The officer was explaining the requirements for becoming a tomb guard, the height restrictions, the physical fitness standards, the background checks that went deeper than top-secret security clearances. Each guard had to be between 5 feet 10 inches and 6 feet 4 inches tall, with a proportionate weight. More importantly, they had to demonstrate unwavering character and dedication. Inside the guard quarters, Rodriguez began the meticulous process of preparing his uniform for storage. Every element had to be perfect for the next ceremony. His shoes required a mirror-like shine that could take hours to achieve. His uniform had to be pressed to exact specifications, with creases sharp enough to cut paper. Even his underwear had specific requirements, white cotton only, changed daily. Through the window, Rodriguez could see the new guard beginning his 21-step march along the black mat that marked the patrol route. The guard would continue this pattern every minute during the day, every 2 minutes at night, regardless of weather conditions. Hurricane winds, blizzards, heat waves. Nothing stopped the vigil. The tomb of the unknown soldier had been continuously guarded every minute of every day since the 2nd of July, 1937. Rodriguez remembered his first night watch, standing alone in the darkness with only the sound of his own footsteps and the distant hum of Washington traffic. During those quiet hours, he had felt the weight of history surrounding him. He thought about all the unknown soldiers throughout American conflicts. Men and women who had given their lives without recognition. Their names lost to time, but their sacrifice remembered through this eternal watch. The colonel's voice grew louder as the cadet group moved closer to the guard quarters. Rodriguez could see them through the window, their young faces serious as they absorbed the lesson about military honor and duty. These cadets would soon become officers themselves, leading troops in an uncertain world where new unknown soldiers might be created. One of the cadets, a tall young man with angular features and intense blue eyes, seemed particularly fascinated by the guard's movements. He watched every step, every turn, studying the precision with an almost scientific attention to detail. Rodriguez noticed how the cadet's hand unconsciously mimicked the rifle movements, as if he were mentally practicing the ceremony. The colonel began explaining the various ceremonies performed at the tomb, including the wreath-laying ceremonies for visiting dignitaries and the special Memorial Day and Veterans Day observances. He described how guards maintained their composure even during emotional moments, such as when families of fallen soldiers visited to pay their respects. Rodriguez finished securing his equipment and prepared to leave for his scheduled rest period. Tomorrow would bring another ceremony, another chance to honor the unknown soldiers through perfect execution of his duties. As he walked past the cadet group, he heard the colonel beginning to explain the most serious aspect of a tomb guard's responsibilities: the absolute requirement to maintain security and dignity of the memorial site. The colonel's voice carried a stern warning as he addressed the cadets about the behavior expected of all visitors, especially military personnel. Any disruption of the ceremony or disrespect toward the memorial was considered a grave offense. Guards had the authority to address such situations immediately and with appropriate force if necessary. Rodriguez paused at the edge of the plaza, looking back at the tomb one more time before heading to his quarters. The afternoon sun was beginning to angle across the memorial, creating a golden glow on the white marble. In a few hours, he would return for another ceremony, continuing the endless cycle of honor and remembrance that defined his service as a tomb guard. The young cadet with the intense blue eyes was now asking questions of the colonel, his voice carrying clearly across the plaza. Rodriguez could hear the enthusiasm in the cadet's tone, the same passion that had driven Rodriguez himself to pursue this assignment. Perhaps this young man would one day stand watch at the tomb himself, continuing the unbroken chain of guardians that stretched back more than 8 decades. As Rodriguez walked away, he reflected on the profound responsibility he carried. Every step he took during his watch represented not just military precision, but a promise to remember those who could not be remembered individually. The unknown soldier represented every service member whose sacrifice might otherwise be forgotten, and the guards ensured that promise would never be broken. 3 days later, Rodriguez was preparing for the afternoon changing of the guard when he noticed the same group of West Point cadets had returned to Arlington Cemetery. This time, they appeared to be on their own, without the supervision of their colonel instructor. The tall cadet, with intense blue eyes, who Rodriguez had observed asking numerous questions during the previous visit, seemed to be leading the group. Cadet James Mitchell had been unable to stop thinking about the tomb guards since their official tour. The precision, the dedication, the unwavering commitment to honor. It represented everything he believed military service should embody. However, Mitchell also carried a burden that his fellow cadets knew nothing about. His older brother, Captain David Mitchell, had been killed in action 3 years earlier, and his body had never been recovered. David was, in essence, one of the unknown soldiers that the tomb represented. Mitchell had convinced his classmates to return to Arlington during their free weekend, ostensibly to learn more about military traditions. In reality, he was wrestling with complex emotions about his brother's sacrifice and his own upcoming commissioning as an officer. The tomb had become a focal point for his grief and his determination to serve with the same honor his brother had displayed. Rodriguez noticed the group of cadets gathering closer to the ceremonial area than typical tourists were allowed. Something in their behavior seemed different from the respectful observation he had witnessed during their guided tour. There was an energy among them, a sense of challenge or bravado, that made Rodriguez slightly uneasy. The changing of the guard ceremony proceeded normally, with Rodriguez executing his duties with the same precision he brought to every performance. As he completed the rifle inspection and prepared to assume his position, he could hear hushed conversations among the cadets. Their voices carried a tone that suggested they were discussing something more than mere academic interest. Mitchell watched the ceremony with the same intense focus as before, but now, his attention had shifted from admiration to analysis. He was studying the guards' movements for weaknesses, looking for any sign that the legendary discipline might be breakable. His grief over his brother's death had twisted into something darker, a need to test whether these honored guardians truly deserved the reverence they received. After the ceremony concluded, the cadets lingered in the area instead of departing with the other visitors. Mitchell approached the information plaques near the tomb, reading aloud to his companions about the requirements and training for tomb guards. His voice grew louder as he began to question whether the standards were truly as rigorous as claimed. Rodriguez had taken his position and begun his first 21-step march when he became aware of the cadets' continued presence. Their conversations were becoming more animated, and their behavior was drawing attention from other visitors. The sanctity of the memorial required absolute silence and respect during the guard's watch, but the cadets seemed either unaware of this requirement or deliberately ignoring it. Mitchell's internal struggle intensified as he watched Rodriguez's measured steps. Part of him desperately wanted to believe that these guards truly understood the sacrifice they were honoring, while another part harbored deep resentment that his brother's specific sacrifice remained unrecognized. The tomb represented all unknown soldiers, but Mitchell wanted someone to know his brother's name, to acknowledge David Mitchell's individual heroism. The group of cadets moved closer to the guard's patrol route, testing the boundaries of acceptable visitor behavior. Mitchell could see other tourists beginning to notice their disruptive presence, some looking annoyed at the distraction from the solemn ceremony. The other guards stationed nearby were also taking notice, their expressions showing concern about the situation developing. Rodriguez completed his turn at the north end of the tomb and began his return march. As he walked, he could hear one of the cadets making comments about the theatrical nature of the ceremony, questioning whether such elaborate rituals were necessary for honoring the dead. The comments were clearly intended to provoke a response, to test the guard's discipline. Mitchell felt his emotions boiling over as he listened to his classmates' disrespectful remarks. His grief, his anger at his brother's death, and his frustration at the anonymity of unknown soldiers combined into a dangerous impulse. He began to see the tomb guard not as a fellow service member deserving respect, but as a symbol of a system that had failed to properly recognize his brother's sacrifice. The other cadets sensed Mitchell's growing agitation and began encouraging him to act on his obvious discontent. They had come to Arlington seeking adventure and a break from the rigid discipline of West Point, and Mitchell's emotional state provided an opportunity for the kind of rebellion that young soldiers sometimes pursued when away from direct supervision. Rodriguez noticed the group's behavior becoming increasingly disruptive, but maintained his composure and continued his prescribed route. Tomb guards were trained to handle various situations while maintaining the dignity of their post. However, the developing situation with the cadets was unlike anything covered in his training. These were not disrespectful tourists or protesters, but future military officers whose behavior should have reflected the highest standards of military courtesy. Mitchell's decision crystallized as Rodriguez approached the south end of the tomb for another turn. The intense young cadet reached into his jacket and withdrew something that made several tourists gasp and step backward. In his hand was a military-issue pistol, standard equipment for West Point cadets during certain training exercises, but completely inappropriate for a visit to Arlington Cemetery. The weapon had been issued to Mitchell for a marksmanship training session scheduled for the following Monday. He had kept it with him, locked in his vehicle, planning to spend the weekend practicing at an approved range. Now, driven by grief and a twisted desire to test the guard's legendary composure, he pointed the pistol directly at Rodriguez's chest. The plaza fell into stunned silence as tourists and visitors realized what was happening. Parents pulled their children behind monument walls, while other adults fumbled for cell phones to call security. The other cadets stared in shock, realizing that their weekend adventure had suddenly become a potential tragedy. Rodriguez felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up as his peripheral vision caught the unmistakable outline of a weapon pointed in his direction. His military training immediately kicked in, but his position as a tomb guard created a unique conflict. He was responsible for maintaining the dignity and security of the memorial, but he was also bound by the precise protocols that governed every aspect of his duty. The moment stretched endlessly as Rodriguez completed his turn and faced directly toward Mitchell and the pointed weapon. The young cadet's hand was trembling slightly, his intense blue eyes now filled with tears as his grief and anger warred with his growing realization of the magnitude of his actions. The pistol remained pointed at the guard's chest, creating a standoff that would test everything both men believed about duty, honor, and sacrifice. Mitchell's classmates began backing away, their faces pale with fear and understanding of the consequences that would inevitably follow. They were witnessing the destruction of their fellow cadet's military career and possibly his freedom, all because of a moment of emotional breakdown triggered by unresolved grief and misplaced anger. Rodriguez stood perfectly still, his own rifle held in the prescribed ceremonial position, his eyes meeting Mitchell's gaze directly. In that instant, both men understood that the next few seconds would determine not only their immediate fate, but also their understanding of what it truly meant to honor the unknown soldiers who lay beneath the marble monument behind them. Rodriguez stood motionless, his eyes locked with Mitchell's, as the seconds stretched into what felt like eternity. The tomb guard's training had prepared him for many scenarios, but nothing quite like this. Facing a fellow service member who was clearly struggling with profound grief and anger, Rodriguez could see the pain behind Mitchell's intense stare, recognizing something of his own past struggles in the young cadet's expression. Mitchell's hand trembled as he held the pistol, his finger hovering near the trigger. The weight of his actions began to crash down on him as he saw the calm dignity in Rodriguez's face. This was not the reaction he had expected. He had anticipated fear, anger, or at least some break in the guard's composure. Instead, he found himself looking into the eyes of someone who seemed to understand his pain. Rodriguez began to speak, his voice low and steady, barely audible to the terrified tourists who remained frozen around the plaza. His words were not the official commands that tomb guards were authorized to give to disruptive visitors. Instead, he spoke as one soldier to another, recognizing the uniform Mitchell wore and the obvious anguish behind his desperate act. "I can see you're hurting," Rodriguez said quietly, never breaking eye contact. "I can see this isn't really about me or this tomb. This is about someone you lost, isn't it?" Mitchell's eyes widened in surprise. He had expected demands for surrender, threats, or calls for security. Instead, this guard was speaking to him as a human being, acknowledging the pain that had driven him to this desperate moment. Tears began to flow freely down Mitchell's cheeks as 3 years of suppressed grief finally found expression. "My brother," Mitchell whispered, his voice breaking. "Captain David Mitchell. He's been missing for 3 years. Killed in action, but they never found his body. He's one of your unknown soldiers, but nobody knows his name. Nobody remembers David specifically." Rodriguez nodded slowly, understanding flooding his features. He had encountered many families of missing service members during his time at Arlington, people struggling with the unique pain of loss without closure. The tomb of the unknown soldier represented their loved ones, but sometimes that symbolic connection felt insufficient when measured against the specific grief for an individual person. "David Mitchell." Rodriguez repeated the name clearly, ensuring that everyone within hearing distance would remember it. "Tell me about your brother, James. Tell me about the man he was." Mitchell's gun hand began to lower slightly as he found himself responding to the genuine interest in Rodriguez's voice. Through his tears, he began to speak about David's childhood dreams of military service, his dedication to his soldiers, and his final mission that had gone terribly wrong in a remote region where recovery operations proved impossible. Rodriguez listened intently, still maintaining his ceremonial position but allowing his human compassion to show in his expression. He understood now that Mitchell's actions were not really an attack on the tomb or its guardians, but a cry for recognition of his brother's individual sacrifice. The young cadet was struggling with the painful paradox that while the tomb honored all unknown soldiers, it could not provide the specific recognition that grieving families desperately needed. "Your brother sounds like he was an exceptional officer and man," Rodriguez said softly. "The kind of soldier who would understand the honor we're trying to show here. But James, he would also understand that honoring the unknown doesn't diminish the memory of the known. David's sacrifice is remembered by everyone who knew him, especially by his brother who followed his path of service." Mitchell's fellow cadets watched in amazement as their classmates' aggressive posture gradually transformed into something resembling the grief-stricken young man they had known since David's death. The pistol continued to lower as Mitchell absorbed Rodriguez's words and began to understand the true meaning of the memorial he had been threatening. Security personnel had arrived at the edges of the plaza, but they held their positions as they observed the developing conversation between the guard and the armed cadet. They could see that Rodriguez had established a connection with the disturbed young man, and that any sudden intervention might escalate the situation dangerously. Rodriguez took a carefully measured step forward, still maintaining eye contact with Mitchell. "The unknown soldiers we guard here include men and women, just like your brother David. They all had names, families, dreams, and people who loved them. We can't know all their names, but we can honor their collective sacrifice and the families who continue to carry their memory." Mitchell finally understood the profound truth that had eluded him in his grief. The tomb of the unknown soldier was not meant to replace individual memory or recognition, but to acknowledge that many heroes would remain unnamed while ensuring their sacrifice was never forgotten. His brother David was remembered by name in the hearts of those who knew him, while also being honored symbolically through the Unknown Soldier Memorial. "I've dishonored everything David stood for," Mitchell said, his voice barely a whisper as the pistol fell to his side. "I've dishonored my uniform, my academy, and the memorial I came here to challenge." Rodriguez shook his head gently. "You've honored your brother by loving him enough to fight for his memory. But David would want you to channel that love into service, not destruction. He would want you to become the kind of officer he was, one who protects and honors rather than threatens and destroys." Mitchell slowly placed the pistol on the ground and stepped away from it, his hands raised to show he was no longer a threat. The color began to return to the faces of his fellow cadets as they realized the immediate danger had passed. Security personnel moved quickly to secure the weapon, while medical personnel approached to check on Mitchell's emotional state. Rodriguez completed his turn and resumed his ceremonial march, maintaining the eternal vigil that had continued uninterrupted despite the dramatic confrontation. His actions demonstrated that while the ceremony could accommodate human compassion and understanding, the fundamental mission of honoring the unknown soldiers would never be compromised. As Mitchell was led away by security personnel and military police, he looked back at the tomb with new understanding. The guard's 21 steps continued their precise pattern, each movement a promise that David Mitchell and thousands of others like him would never be forgotten. The unknown soldiers represented in the tomb included his brother not by name, but by the universal recognition that some heroes must remain anonymous while their sacrifice endures forever. Rodriguez continued his watch as tourists gradually returned to the Memorial Plaza, their faces showing a mixture of relief and deep reflection on what they had witnessed. The confrontation had revealed the profound emotional power of the tomb of the unknown soldier and the complex relationships between individual memory and collective honor. In the days that followed, Mitchell faced military justice for his actions. But the story of his grief and the guards' compassionate response became a powerful lesson at West Point about leadership, empathy, and the true meaning of military service. Rodriguez received commendation for his handling of the crisis, though he maintained that he had simply done what any soldier should do when confronted with a fellow service member in pain. The incident reminded everyone involved that behind every uniform, every ceremony, and every memorial stood real people dealing with real loss, real pain, and real hope. The tomb of the unknown soldier continued its eternal vigil, watched over by guards who understood that their duty encompassed not only military precision, but also human compassion for those who struggled to understand their loss in the context of larger service and sacrifice. Mitchell eventually returned to complete his education at West Point, carrying with him a deeper understanding of honor, grief, and the complex ways that military service connects individual sacrifice to larger principles of duty and remembrance. His brother David remained unknown to the tomb's official record, but his memory lived on in the heart of a young officer who had learned to honor the unknown while never forgetting the known.